Hello and welcome. I'm Ashley of The Ugly Sheep, and today we're gonna make 1780s stays. So I bought these 1780s Clockwork Fairy stays pattern kind of a while ago now, having wanted to make a pair of stays for myself. Part of the reason is I am short. So even through this process, my lining is essentially going to be my mock-up because I have concerns that I'm going to have to take at least an inch, maybe a little bit more, off the height of these stays. So I have already downloaded the pattern and put it together and cut out the pattern pieces. So now it's time to get started in our lining, or for right now it's our mock-up. If it fits well, it will be our lining. If I have to make adjustments, it will just end up being a mock-up, and I will have to make a second mock-up just to be sure everything fits. So let's get started. I used this muslin that I had laying around that I used for what ended up being the interfacing and the lining of the corset. It ended up being that when I put the mock-up together, it was hard to tell what would need to be changed without making a full set of stays. And so I did some basic, like, does it line up okay? But with how the stays are constructed, I actually had to take everything apart that I had put together. So I used them as interfacing instead of the lining just to make sure that there was going to be enough structural integrity there for the lining to not warp too far out of whack. Because I ended up using what I cut out as the interfacing for the stays, I did end up having to cut out a second set of pieces from this exact same fabric for the lining. And so I ended up using probably close to 2 yards of this fabric for the stays, just for the lining and interfacing. The fabric I used for the outer part of the stays is actually the leftover fabric from the skirt I made a few weeks back, and I'll put a card to that video. And I also used the shirt that I had made that it just ended up being too big. And so instead of cutting it down, I decided to use it to make these stays. I'm actually really glad I went with this fabric because it ended up turning out so cute. And because I used a thinner fabric than I was initially planning to, that's why I did end up deciding to interface all the pieces of the stays. If I had used the original canvas that I was planning to use, I wasn't going to interface them, but I think that would have ended up being too bulky because even with this fabric and the muslin as interfacing, it's still very much thinner fabric than the canvas would have been as a single layer. So the first step in this process, once all of the pieces are cut out, is to use small amounts of hem tape to temporarily fuse your outer layer and your interfacing together. And this was not a really fun to watch process, so I did not record it. But basically, you take little bits of the hem tape and put it on the outer fabric on the wrong side, and then put the interfacing over top and use your iron to fuse it all together. There's actually a lot of ironing in this project. I didn't record any of it. You're just gonna have to trust me that I did do all of the ironing. And it was copious amounts of ironing. And because I used cotton, I also was able to steam everything, which I did so that I could get nice crisp lines and edges. And so I ended up having to fill my well for my iron at least twice during this process. Once I had the seam line for the center front and center back and the boning channels marked on the inside of my corset, I had to then sew the front center pieces together. So it puts together the outer, the interfacing, and the lining layer. And then I sewed the boning channels onto this for both front pieces and both center back pieces. I think one of the hardest things throughout this whole project was making sure that I kept my boning channels wide enough for the bones to be able to slide in easily. And I also had a lot of visible stitching, which meant I had to be very careful with my stitching. The other issue I was running into is that I had to sew my pieces from the back because I could not really see the heat erasable pen on the front, and I had a lot of troubles with that, so I used tailor's chalk instead, and that was really hard to get off of my fabric. So I had to mark everything from the back and go very slowly to ensure that my bobbin thread stayed really nice and neat along the front side where you're going to see all of the stitching for the boning channels. So because I was having such a problem, I ended up using this transfer paper and a wheel that has all the spikes around it in order to transfer all of the markings necessary onto the back side of my fabric because it just did not come off the front side. This method was actually really easy and it was super fast, much faster than trying to connect the dots when I was trying to use the heat erase pen from the front. So I would definitely recommend this method if you're going to make this with a print fabric. So once I had the markings transferred to the front side, I actually had to put two of the bones in the center front panels because what you do is you take your front center panel and have it sandwiched between the outer part of your side front and the lining of your side front and sew them up the seams so that you basically are sewing each piece together with the seams covered, but you are also making sure that you're sewing them all on at the same time, which I think ended up making it so much easier to line up the front fabric to the lining fabric than if I had made the lining and made the front parts separately and then tried to put them together. This was super easy. And then once you have everything together for the first set of panels, you iron everything flat and you sew in your boning channels as you go, which also helps kind of break up some of the monotony of sewing all of the boning channels because there are almost 30 boning channels in this project. So I think this was just a really good construction method that she had designed. I have to say, I was really worried about how complicated this whole process was going to be, but the instructions that came with the pattern were amazing, and in places that seemed a little confusing, there were links to videos to show you how to actually do the steps. So if you want to make a similar set of stays, or she actually has various patterns of stays, I would very much recommend buying one of the Clockwork Fairy designs. Once all the pieces were together, it was time to bind the bottom edge. I chose not to record that because I knew that was going to be a very hard and tedious part of this project with all of the points that you have to sew. So I'll show you how I did the binding once I get to the top part of the stays. After the binding was on the bottom, it was time to measure, cut, and insert the various bones in the channels. I got the synthetic baleen, and I'm really happy I did. It's very light and flexible and easy to work with. I was also able to order it in spools, which was so much cheaper than trying to get stuff that was pre-measured the right size. And I also didn't have to worry about trying to either put this together and measure it or hope that I had sewed it perfectly with the measurements that I got from the different pieces for the pattern. So I would highly recommend this. And then I also took a file and just filed the edges to make the individual bones round on both sides, just to help keep it from snagging the fabric or trying to poke through. Despite the number of bones that I had to measure, cut, round off, and then insert, this process was actually fairly quick. This was actually much faster than even putting the grommets in, which I did next. And I did not record putting the grommets in, partially because it was just such a hard, tedious process because of how many layers that you have to work your way through, that I did it kind of a little at a time. And even in some of the subsequent video here, you're going to see where I have kind of paused doing grommets and started doing some other things. It just made it easier on my hands. Once the bones are installed and the grommets are on, it's time to bind the top edge of the stays. And to do this, you sew just a little short of your seam allowance along the entire top. And then once you're done sewing, you cut the seam allowance down so that you can have all of your pieces together and secure without too much extra seam allowance, and it levels off all of your pieces to make the binding just so much easier. The pattern actually does not call for bias tape or ribbon. It has you use Petersham so that you can have a lot of flexibility in how you move it. It is a very flexible material, and in cotton it is super easy to steam in place once you're done. And so I've actually watched several other content creators make stays, and the binding was something that they really struggled with to make look nice on the front and the back. And given the method in this pattern, I didn't really have any problems with that. There were a couple places where I needed to go back and make sure it was tacked in place well, especially around some of the sharper curves. But I didn't have as many problems about getting it to lay nicely on the backside once I had tried to flip it over. I think part of that is because you bind it from the front and back at the same time. You're not sewing on your binding tape and then pulling it to the back to secure. Even around the bottom where you have to use a lot of binding because you have to go and bind each tab, so there's just more space to bind. The process did not take nearly as long as I thought it would. And in fact, the only part of the process that took a lot longer than I thought was the grommets. Everything else actually went way faster and more smoothly than I had anticipated. Even with that, this was still a 2-week project for me. It was a lot of sewing. It is a time-intensive project, but I was really concerned about the skill level for this project, and that really was not as big of a problem as I had thought it would be. Now that the top and bottom are binded and the stays are made, it is time to make the stomacher. And this is a very interesting construction. Once you sew the bottom and both sides, right sides together, you flip it out, press it, and actually put embroidery canvas, like the plastic embroidery canvas, in the center of it to keep it nice and shaped instead of having to do like the buckram that is glued. So you can actually hand wash your stays once they're done. And this is the only part where you needed the metal bone, and it's acting as a bit of a busk. It's a thicker um, piece of metal, not so much that it's thick like front to back, but it's thicker left to right than your other bones by about double, but it's still fairly flexible, and I didn't find any problems moving in it. Once the stomacher's done, it's just time to lace up the stays, and there are laces on the front and the back of these versions of the stays. Plus you have to do lacing at the shoulders for the straps. So that did take a bit of time, but once I'm done with that, we can go on to the reveal. So for some reason, my audio did not record for this final shot, but I just was saying that I really loved the way that the corset turned out. I think I need to take a little bit out of the straps in the back and a little bit out of the arm's eye underneath. But those are very small adjustments that I think I need to make to this pattern, and I think part of that just has to do with my height and not really the shape of the garment itself. And I probably was saying something about leaving me a comment below, liking and subscribing, and I'll see you next time.